On a cold Christmas Eve, a struggling young man offers food to a lonely old man in the park. But when the old man removes his worn-out scarf, revealing an identity hidden for decades, the young man's life changes forever. Snowflakes swirled through the dimly lit streets, blanketing the city in a hush that only Christmas Eve could bring. The world sparkled with festive lights, laughter echoed from warm homes, and the scent of roasted chestnuts drifted from the street vendors. But for Daniel Carter, Christmas was just another reminder of how alone he was. With an old backpack slung over his shoulder, Daniel pulled his threadbare coat tighter against the biting wind. His hands, stiff from the cold, gripped a small takeout container, his last meal of the day. The world around him was alive with holiday cheer, but in his pockets, just a few crumpled bills and loose change. He had lost his job 2 months ago, and with it, the last bit of stability he had left. He sighed, staring at the glowing Christmas decorations in the bakery window. Freshly baked pies and sugar-dusted pastries lined the shelves, a cruel temptation for an empty stomach. A deep ache settled in his chest, not just from hunger, but from the weight of a future that seemed more uncertain with every passing day. As he turned away, he spotted something, or rather, someone. Across the street, an elderly man sat alone on a bench, his frail frame wrapped in a tattered coat. His hands, covered in worn-out gloves, clutched a small, empty paper cup. Despite the cheerful holiday lights dancing above him, his gaze was fixed on the ground, distant and hollow. Daniel hesitated. He was barely surviving himself. He should just walk away. But something in the old man's posture, the quiet grief, the loneliness, made him stop. Clutching the takeout box in his frozen fingers, he took a deep breath and walked toward him. "Sir?" Daniel's voice was cautious, unsure. The old man barely moved, his breath coming out in slow, visible puffs in the freezing air. Daniel sat beside him and held out the container. "It's not much, but it's warm." The old man lifted his head, and for the first time, Daniel saw his face, lined with age, eyes weary but filled with something deeper, something broken. He blinked as if surprised by the offer, then slowly accepted it with trembling hands. "You don't have to do this, son," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken much in days. Daniel shrugged. "It's Christmas." The man stared at the steaming meal in his lap before whispering, "I used to love Christmas." His lips trembled as if he wanted to say more, but silence swallowed the words. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Do you have a place to go?" The old man let out a weak chuckle. "Nowhere that matters." Daniel frowned. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something heavy. He wanted to ask, wanted to know why this man was sitting alone in the cold, but he didn't want to pry. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped gift, a pair of woolen gloves he had bought with his last few dollars. He hadn't planned on giving them away, but now it felt like the right thing to do. "Merry Christmas," he said, handing it over. The old man looked at the package for a long time before his fingers finally curled around it. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. He simply held the gift, his fingers pressing into the wrapping paper as if trying to hold on to something long gone. Finally, in a voice so soft Daniel almost missed it, he murmured, "You remind me of someone I lost." Daniel's brows furrowed. Before he could ask what he meant, the sound of screeching tires echoed through the street. A sleek black car pulled up at the curb. Daniel turned as the car door swung open. A sharply dressed man in a dark coat stepped out, his movements precise, calculated. He was clearly looking for someone. The old man stiffened beside him. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, his voice tight with urgency. "Sir, we've been looking for you." Daniel's stomach dropped. Whitmore? The name sounded familiar, like something from the newspapers. The old man, Mr. Whitmore, closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "I told you not to find me." The man in the coat stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You can't disappear like this. You have people worried." Whitmore let out a dry chuckle. "I don't think anyone truly cares where I go anymore." Daniel looked between them, confused. Who was this man? And why did he sound like someone with nothing left to lose? Then the driver of the car stepped out, holding something Daniel didn't expect. A leather-bound will. "Sir," the man in the coat pressed on, "your family is waiting, and the board members are restless." Board members? Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't just some old man. He swallowed hard, his mind racing through every headline he had skimmed at the library. And then, it hit him. Arthur Whitmore, the billionaire CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, the man whose sudden disappearance had sent shockwaves through the business world. Daniel felt his heart pound. The man he had just shared his only meal with was one of the wealthiest men in the country. Arthur Whitmore turned back to Daniel, his weary eyes filled with something unreadable. "You don't recognize me, do you?" he asked. Daniel shook his head, still processing the reality of the moment. The billionaire smiled faintly. "Good. Maybe that's why you were kind to me." Daniel's mouth went dry. He had given his last meal, his last gift, to a man who could buy the entire city 10 times over. And yet, Whitmore had sat here in the cold, ignored, forgotten, like he was no different from the homeless that lined the alleyways. The man in the coat stepped forward again. "Mr. Whitmore, please. There's something urgent we must discuss." Whitmore's fingers tightened around the wrapped gloves Daniel had given him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse. "I'm not ready to go back yet." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Then at least, give him this." He handed Daniel an envelope, heavy, sealed with wax. "What is this?" Daniel asked cautiously. Whitmore exhaled. "A thank you. And maybe a second chance." Daniel's fingers trembled as he took it. He had no idea that inside that envelope was something that would change his life forever. As the black car drove away, disappearing into the snowy night, Daniel sat in stunned silence. He had thought he was giving to someone in need, but perhaps he had just been given the greatest gift of all. Daniel sat on the cold park bench, his fingers trembling as he stared at the heavy envelope in his lap. The night air, once simply cold, now felt thick with the weight of a revelation he wasn't prepared for. Arthur Whitmore, the billionaire recluse the world thought was missing, had just shared a meal with him, and now he had handed him something that felt far too important for a struggling man like him to hold. His first instinct? Don't open it. This wasn't his world. He was just an unemployed man barely scraping by, surviving on borrowed time and luck. People like him didn't belong in stories like this. But the way Arthur had looked at him before driving away, the quiet pain in his eyes, told Daniel this wasn't some random act of generosity. This was intentional. Slowly, he peeled back the wax seal and unfolded the thick piece of paper inside. His heart nearly stopped. It was a check. And not just any check. It had more zeros than Daniel had ever seen in his life. $250,000. His breath hitched. This had to be a mistake. On the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a note. "Use it wisely. You may need it more than you realize." What did that mean? Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't naive. Money like this didn't just fall from the sky, and it certainly wasn't given away without a reason. So the real question was, what did Arthur Whitmore see in him, and why did it feel like this was only the beginning? Daniel didn't go home right away. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, suspicions, and a growing sense of unease he couldn't shake. By the time he finally stumbled into his tiny one-room apartment, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones. His place was nothing special: peeling wallpaper, a flickering overhead light, and a mattress on the floor. But it was his. For now. He dropped the envelope onto the small, scratched-up table, staring at it like it might disappear if he looked away. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he muttered to himself. Half of him wanted to cash the check immediately, to pay off the months of overdue rent, to finally eat something that wasn't from a discount aisle, to breathe without the constant weight of poverty crushing him. But the other half? It told him this money came with strings. And just as that thought settled in his mind, bang, bang, bang. Someone was knocking. Daniel's stomach twisted. He wasn't expecting anyone. And in his neighborhood? A knock that late usually meant trouble. Slowly, he approached the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. When he pulled it open, his breath caught. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his posture too stiff, too formal for a place like this. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, calculating. And in his hand? A business card. "Daniel Carter?" the man asked, his voice smooth but cold. Daniel hesitated. "Who's asking?" The man extended the card. "Ethan Graves. Whitmore Enterprises." Daniel stared at the name, confusion tightening around his ribs. The man, Ethan, tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you again." Daniel's fingers twitched against the doorframe. He should say no. He should run. But something about the way the man was looking at him, like he already knew Daniel wouldn't refuse, made it clear. This wasn't a request. It was an invitation he couldn't afford to ignore. The next morning, Daniel found himself standing in front of a towering glass skyscraper, Whitmore Enterprises. It was the kind of building that people like him never stepped foot in. The kind of place where security eyed you like you didn't belong. And yet, here he was. When he entered, the sheer wealth of the place made his stomach twist. Marble floors, a chandelier that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. People in crisp suits who had never known hunger a day in their lives. And then, all eyes turned to him. He felt it instantly. The stares, the barely concealed whispers. What was someone like him doing in a place like this? Before he could second-guess himself, Ethan Graves appeared again. The man moved with effortless confidence, his sharp gaze scanning Daniel from head to toe. "This way," he said, without waiting for a response. Daniel followed him past a set of frosted glass doors, the air growing colder. Not from temperature, but from the sheer power humming through the halls. Finally, they stopped in front of a massive office. Ethan knocked once, then pushed the door open. Daniel stepped inside. Arthur Whitmore sat behind a mahogany desk, his fingers steepled, his gaze unreadable. He looked stronger than he had the night before, more like the billionaire the world once knew, and less like the grieving man Daniel had met in the cold. "Daniel," Arthur said, his voice low but firm. "Sit." Daniel didn't move right away. His instinct screamed at him that he was about to hear something he wasn't ready for, but he sat anyway. Arthur studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You must be wondering why I gave you that check." Daniel exhaled. "Yeah, among other things." A faint smile ghosted across Arthur's face. "Good. That means you're not a fool." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes darkening. "There's something I need you to do for me." Daniel's heart skipped. There it was, the catch. He straightened, cautious. "What kind of something?" Arthur's fingers drummed against the desk. "I want you to help me find out who's trying to take everything from me." Daniel blinked. I don't understand." Arthur let out a slow breath. "I didn't just disappear, Daniel. Someone wanted me gone." Daniel felt the air shift, heavier. Arthur leaned in, his gaze sharp. "And I think you might be the only person I can trust." Daniel didn't know how to respond. Because suddenly this wasn't just about a meal. This was about something far, far bigger. And before he even knew it, he was already in too deep. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. This was insane. Just 24 hours ago, he had been shivering on a park bench, trying to stretch his last meal as long as possible. Now, a billionaire was telling him that someone wanted him gone, that someone had been trying to erase him. And for some inexplicable reason, Arthur Whitmore thought Daniel was the only person he could trust. You don't even know me," Daniel finally said, shifting uncomfortably in the sleek leather chair. "I could be anybody." Arthur's gaze didn't waver. "That's exactly why I chose you." Daniel frowned. "That makes no sense." Arthur leaned forward, his voice quiet but weighted. "Because I know every person in my life, every employee, every business partner, every so-called friend, and not a single one of them hesitated when I disappeared." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. Arthur exhaled, his eyes flickering with something that almost looked like regret. I don't know who's behind this yet, but I do know one thing. It's someone close to me, someone who stands to gain from my absence. Daniel's grip tightened on the arms of the chair. He had read about things like this, greedy family members, business betrayals. But those were stories, things that happened to people in a different world than his. And yet, now he was in the middle of one. Arthur watched him closely. You're an outsider, Daniel. You have no ties to this world. That makes you valuable. No one will suspect you're helping me. Daniel hesitated. And what exactly are you asking me to do? Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line. I need you to go where I can't. Daniel blinked. You want me to, spy for you? Arthur didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid something across the desk. A key card. Daniel picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The letters W.E. were embossed in silver. Whitmore Enterprises. Arthur's voice was calm, but deadly serious. Someone in my company tried to erase me. Find out who. Daniel's pulse pounded. This was too much, too big, too dangerous, and yet, somewhere, deep in his gut, he knew he wasn't going to say no. The next morning, Daniel stood outside Whitmore Enterprises, clutching the key card in his sweaty palm. This was a mistake. He had no business being here. He wasn't some corporate investigator or detective. He was just a guy trying to survive. And yet, here he was, walking straight into the lion's den. Swallowing his nerves, he pulled his borrowed blazer tighter around himself and pushed through the glass doors. The lobby was even more intimidating than he remembered. Polished floors, towering ceilings, employees moving with purpose and confidence. Daniel did not belong here, but he forced himself to walk toward the security desk, keeping his expression neutral. The guard barely glanced at him before nodding. Morning. Daniel froze. Had Arthur already set this up for him? He gave a tight smile and slid the key card across the scanner. Beep. The light turned green. He was in. His hands clenched into fists as he stepped toward the elevators. He had no plan, no idea where to even start. All he had was a billionaire's trust and a growing feeling that he was being watched. Daniel stepped onto the 20th floor, heart hammering. Arthur had told him to start here, the executive offices. People in expensive suits moved through the halls, their conversations hushed but urgent. The tension in the air was palpable, like everyone was waiting for something to explode. He walked slowly, scanning the names on the office doors. Then he found it. Eleanor Shaw, Arthur's former executive assistant, the one person he had warned Daniel about. She knows more than she lets on, Arthur had said. Daniel took a deep breath, knocked once, and pushed the door open. Eleanor Shaw looked up from her desk, her sharp eyes immediately narrowing. Who are you? She asked, her tone clipped. Daniel forced a polite smile. New hire, IT support. Her gaze didn't soften. You're lying, she said flatly. Daniel stiffened. She tilted her head, studying him. Arthur sent you, didn't he? His stomach dropped. How did she... Eleanor exhaled, rubbing her temples. Of course he did. That stubborn old man. Daniel hesitated. You knew he was alive? Eleanor shot him a sharp look. Of course I did. Daniel's pulse raced. Then why didn't you... Because, she cut him off, lowering her voice, he's in more danger than he realizes. Daniel's throat went dry. Wait, you're saying... Eleanor stood, grabbing her coat. Come with me, she said urgently. If you want to help Arthur, you need to see something. Daniel didn't move. He could walk away now, pretend none of this ever happened. But the look in Eleanor's eyes, the sheer fear, told him one thing. This wasn't just about Arthur's money. This was about his life. And Daniel was already in too deep to turn back. Now Eleanor didn't wait for Daniel to respond. She grabbed her coat, locked her office door, and motioned for him to follow. Daniel hesitated for only a second before stepping after her. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, that whatever he was about to get involved in was bigger than he could handle. But he couldn't stop now. Not when Arthur Whitmore, a man who had given him more trust than he deserved, was depending on him. Eleanor moved swiftly, leading him down a dimly lit hallway that wasn't on the main floor plan. Unlike the polished executive offices, this corridor was cold, the lights flickering slightly as if no one had been here in a long time. "What is this place?" Daniel asked under his breath. Eleanor didn't answer. At the end of the hallway, she swiped an access card, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside was a small room filled with filing cabinets, a couple of computer monitors, and stacks of papers that looked decades old. A hidden records room. Eleanor closed the door behind them and turned to face him. "You need to understand something," she said, her voice low. "Arthur didn't just disappear. Someone wanted him gone. And whoever it is, they're still here." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Here? Like, in the company?" She nodded. "I've been looking into it since the day he vanished, but I can't do it alone anymore." She walked over to a filing cabinet, yanked open a drawer, and pulled out a thick folder labeled Restricted. Flipping it open, she revealed bank transactions, legal documents, and internal emails. Daniel frowned, scanning them quickly. "These are evidence," Eleanor finished. "Proof that someone has been quietly transferring company assets offshore, and not just recently, for years." Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about Arthur losing his fortune. This was organized theft on a massive scale. "Who's behind it?" he asked. Eleanor exhaled. "That's the problem. The transactions are linked to dummy accounts. But one name keeps showing up in connection with them." She slid a photograph across the table. Daniel picked it up and felt his blood go cold. It was Ethan Graves, Arthur's right-hand man, the same man who had personally escorted Daniel into Whitmore Enterprises that morning. Daniel gripped the edges of the photo, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about money. This was about betrayal. And Arthur's greatest enemy was right under his nose. Daniel felt a sharp chill crawl down his spine. Ethan Graves, the man who had looked him dead in the eye that morning, pretending to be on Arthur's side, was the one orchestrating his downfall. Eleanor watched his reaction carefully. "I take it you've already met him?" Daniel nodded, gripping the folder tighter. "Yeah. And he didn't seem too thrilled that Arthur gave me that check." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's because Ethan has spent years making sure no one else gains Arthur's trust. And now, out of nowhere, you show up." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. "So what do we do?" Eleanor hesitated, then said, "We find out what Ethan's next move is, before he makes it." She grabbed a tiny earpiece from the desk and handed it to him. Daniel frowned. "What's this for?" Eleanor sighed. "Tonight, Ethan is hosting an exclusive board meeting in the private executive lounge on the 50th floor." Daniel's stomach sank. "And I'm supposed to—" "What? Sneak in?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. You just need to get close enough to eavesdrop. If he's planning something big, he'll talk about it there." Daniel let out a slow breath. "And if I get caught?" Eleanor's gaze hardened. "Then you better run." That night, Daniel stood outside the executive lounge, his pulse pounding in his ears. Through the partially frosted glass doors, he could see the outlines of men in dark suits, their voices low but serious. The Whitmore Enterprises board, and at the head of the table, Ethan Graves. Daniel swallowed hard and pressed Eleanor's earpiece deeper into his ear, adjusting the small mic she had given him earlier. "Okay," Eleanor's voice crackled softly through the receiver. "You're in position. Now just stay quiet." Daniel edged closer, pretending to scroll through his phone while angling his body toward the meeting. Then Ethan's voice cut through the air. "It's time to finalize the transition." Daniel's breath hitched. "Transition?" Ethan continued. "Arthur isn't coming back, and even if he does, he won't have anything left to return to." A murmur of agreement rippled through the board. Daniel's fingers clenched into fists. They were stealing everything from him? Another board member spoke up. And what about the money? Ethan chuckled. Already taken care of. By the time anyone even notices, the final transfers will be complete. Daniel felt his stomach twist. This was it. The final move. The endgame. Arthur wasn't just being pushed out. They were about to erase him entirely. Daniel's mind raced. He had to stop this. But before he could move, "You there." His blood ran cold. The room had gone silent, and every eye in the lounge was now looking directly at him. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He had seconds to react. He forced a confused smile, holding up his phone. "Sorry, just waiting for the elevator." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He knew. Daniel didn't wait to find out what happened next. He ran. He turned and sprinted toward the elevator, slamming his finger against the button. Behind him, chairs scraped against the floor. Footsteps, heavy and fast, echoed through the hall. Daniel's stomach lurched as he glanced over his shoulder. 2 men were coming after him. The elevator doors opened just in time. He lunged inside, slamming the close button. The last thing he saw before the doors shut. Ethan, standing perfectly still, watching him with a deadly, knowing smile. And then, the power cut out. The elevator stopped mid-floor, and Daniel was trapped. The elevator was dead silent. Daniel pressed himself against the cold metal wall, his breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows in the small space. He was trapped. His fingers twitched toward the emergency button. He pressed it, but all that came back was static. No signal, no escape. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. They must have cut the power on purpose. Ethan had seen him, knew he had been listening. And now? He was probably sending people after him. Daniel's eyes darted to the ceiling hatch. Could he climb through? Number. He wasn't in an action movie. He didn't know how to pry open an elevator shaft. His only option? Wait. And hope he wasn't waiting for someone who wanted him dead. A few agonizing minutes passed. His thoughts spiraled. What if this was the end? What if Ethan had already won? Then, a beep. The lights flickered back on. The elevator lurched downward. Daniel tensed, preparing for the worst. The doors slid open. He wasn't alone. 2 men in security uniforms stood outside, but their eyes, cold, unblinking, told him they weren't here to help. One of them spoke. "Come with us." Daniel didn't resist. What was the point? If he ran, they'd catch him. If he fought, he'd lose. So he let them escort him through the eerily quiet building, past empty corridors and offices filled with shadows. They brought him to a private boardroom. Inside, sitting at the long, polished table, waiting for him, was Ethan Graves. "Mr. Carter," Ethan said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "You've been busy." Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "I could say the same about you." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, I was actually impressed at first. Arthur picking some random street kid off the bench? Unusual, sure, but not a terrible move. But now?" His eyes darkened. "Now you're becoming a problem." Daniel forced himself to keep his voice steady. "So what happens now? You make me disappear too?" Ethan smiled. "That depends on you." He tapped a manila folder sitting on the table. Inside were pictures of Daniel, taken over the past several days, entering Whitmore Enterprises, speaking with Eleanor, leaving Arthur's hidden safe house. Ethan had been watching him the entire time. Daniel's stomach turned. "You really think you're special?" Ethan continued, his tone almost mocking. "You think Arthur trusts you? Please, you're just another disposable pawn." Daniel swallowed hard. "You stole from him. You tried to erase him." Ethan didn't even flinch. "Of course I did." His calmness sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "This company needs someone who knows how to lead," Ethan went on, adjusting his cufflinks. "Arthur was weak. He let emotions get in the way of business. Me? I'm willing to do what's necessary. Daniel's hands curled into fists. This man had plotted against Arthur for years, had stolen from him, lied to him. And now? He was going to get away with it. Unless Daniel did something. Ethan sighed. So, here's how this is going to work. You're going to take Arthur's money, live your life, walk away, and you never, ever mention his name again. He slid a contract across the table. Daniel glanced down. A non-disclosure agreement. If he signed this, he was done. Arthur was done. Ethan's lips curled. Do the smart thing, Daniel. Daniel stared at the paper. His heart pounded. He needed time. He needed to think. And then? The boardroom door slammed open. Eleanor rushed inside. Her face was ashen. And the words that left her mouth? They changed everything. Ethan isn't the real enemy. Daniel froze. Ethan stiffened. Excuse me? Eleanor looked between them, her breath shaky. You've been chasing the wrong person, Daniel. Ethan might be a thief, but he's not the one who wanted Arthur dead. Daniel's blood ran cold. What? She stepped forward, tossing another file onto the table. Daniel picked it up, flipping it open. And his world shattered. Inside were bank records, emails. Paper trails leading to someone higher up, someone with even more to gain from Arthur's disappearance. Daniel felt his entire body go numb. Because at the bottom of the last document, stamped with clear, undeniable proof, was the name of the real traitor, Arthur Whitmore's own son. Daniel's hands trembled as he stared at the documents in front of him. This couldn't be right. Arthur Whitmore's own son, Michael Whitmore, was behind everything? His mind replayed everything in fast forward. The betrayal, the missing money, Arthur's disappearance. It all led back to the one person who should have been the closest to him. Ethan's jaw clenched as he scanned the files. Even he looked shocked. Where did you get these? Ethan asked, his voice tight. Eleanor's expression was grim. I've been looking in the wrong place. Just like you. Daniel couldn't breathe. Arthur has a son? Eleanor nodded. Yes. And Michael was supposed to take over Whitmore Enterprises after his father stepped down. But Arthur, he didn't trust him. He saw what Michael was becoming. Daniel felt his pulse hammer against his skull. So he cut him out? Eleanor exhaled. Arthur was planning to name someone else as his successor, but before he could finalize it, he disappeared. Daniel's stomach dropped. Michael had erased his own father to steal his empire, and they had been focusing on the wrong man this entire time. Ethan cursed under his breath. This is bigger than I thought. Daniel turned to him sharply. What do you mean? You were helping him steal from Arthur. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. Number I was taking the money, sure. But I thought I was just freezing Arthur out of his company. Business, nothing more. I didn't know Michael wanted him dead. Daniel's breath hitched. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier. Arthur's still alive, Daniel whispered. But for how long? Eleanor's face darkened, and that's when it hit him. If Michael knew Arthur had resurfaced, he wouldn't let him live much longer. We need to get to Arthur, Daniel said, pushing away from the table. Eleanor nodded. He's safe for now, but if Michael finds out... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Daniel grabbed the files, tucking them under his coat. We have to go. Ethan stood up as well. I'm coming with you. Daniel shot him a look. Why should we trust you? Ethan's expression was unreadable. Because if Michael really did all this, then I was just a pawn too, and I don't like being used. Daniel hesitated for only a second before nodding. They didn't have time to argue. They rushed out of the boardroom, moving quickly through the empty halls of Whitmore Enterprises. The moment they stepped outside, everything changed. A black SUV screeched to a stop at the curb. The doors slammed open. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements swift, calculated. Not security, not corporate men, hired killers. Daniel barely had time to react before Eleanor shoved him aside. "Run!" she shouted. The men pulled out weapons. Daniel's heart pounded. He turned, sprinting down the street as gunshots cracked through the air. Ethan cursed, diving behind a parked car. Eleanor was already moving, leading them through the alley, but Daniel knew one thing for sure. Michael knew. And now, Arthur Whitmore wasn't just in danger. He was being hunted. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the city. Daniel's lungs burned. His legs felt like they would give out. They finally ducked into an abandoned warehouse, panting, gasping for air. "We need to call Arthur," Eleanor said, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. Ethan ran a hand down his face. "Michael must have found out hours ago. We're already too late." Daniel's throat went dry. "What do you mean?" Ethan gave him a grave look. "If Michael's men were waiting for us, it means Arthur's safe house is already compromised." Daniel felt his stomach churn. Arthur wasn't just at risk. He was a dead man walking. Eleanor pressed her phone to her ear. "Come on, pick up, pick up." The line rang, once, twice, then static. A robotic voice. "This number is no longer in service." Daniel's chest tightened. Ethan's eyes darkened. They got to him. The room was deathly silent. For the first time since this started, Daniel felt real fear. "No," Daniel said, shaking his head. He's still alive. He has to be." Eleanor gritted her teeth. "We don't know that." Daniel clenched his fists. "Then we find out." Ethan looked between them. "You're not thinking of going to his last location, are you?" Daniel met his gaze, steady. "What choice do we have?" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "We go now. Before Michael finishes what he started." Ethan let out a sharp exhale. "Fine. But if we're walking into a trap, I hope you're ready for what comes next." Daniel didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The old cabin was eerily silent. Daniel could hear nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he, Eleanor, and Ethan pushed through the dense woods toward the secluded hideout where Arthur had been staying. Snow crunched beneath their hurried steps. The moon, barely peeking through the thick clouds, cast eerie shadows along the frozen ground. Daniel's gut twisted. Something was wrong. He could feel it before he even saw the cabin's front door, wide open, swinging slightly in the winter wind. He broke into a run. "Arthur!" he called, his voice raw, desperate. No answer. Inside, the place was destroyed. Papers were scattered across the wooden floor. Furniture overturned. A cup of coffee, long gone cold, had spilled across the table. And then, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A streak of blood smeared across the floorboards. Eleanor covered her mouth. "Oh my God!" Daniel's hands shook. He's not here." But that didn't mean he was alive. Ethan kicked over a chair, his face dark with anger. "Damn it, we were too late." Daniel refused to believe it. He moved quickly, searching the room for any sign that Arthur had escaped. He checked the bathroom, the bedroom, the small kitchen. Nothing. Then he saw it. A piece of paper, half crumpled, lying near the fireplace. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. It was a note, hastily written, almost illegible. "He found me. If you're reading this, I'm either gone or running. Michael knows. Don't trust anyone." Daniel's chest tightened. Arthur was alive, or at least he had been when he wrote this. But if Michael had reached him first, Eleanor's voice was a whisper. "What do we do now?" For the first time, Daniel didn't know. Hours passed. Daniel sat on the cabin floor, staring at the cold fireplace. His fingers curled into fists, his mind racing. He had thought he was helping. He had thought he was getting closer to saving Arthur. But instead, he had led the enemy right to him. His body felt heavy. Number. The weight of failure pressed down on his chest like a crushing force. "I should have been faster," he muttered. "I should have figured it out sooner." Eleanor kneeled beside him. "This isn't your fault, Daniel." But he couldn't believe that. Ethan exhaled sharply from across the room. This was a game we were never meant to win. Michael's been playing this for years. He's always been ahead of us. Daniel's hands tightened. So that was it? They were giving up? After everything? The thought of Arthur alone, possibly hurt, or worse, dead, made Daniel's stomach twist. Michael had stolen everything from him, his own father, his empire, his legacy. Daniel couldn't let him steal his life too. Slowly, he pushed himself up from the floor, his exhaustion replaced by something sharper: determination. Michael Whitmore had made one mistake. He underestimated Daniel. Daniel turned to Eleanor and Ethan. "We're not done," he said. Ethan scoffed. "And what exactly do you think we're going to do, Carter?" "We have no leads, no plan, and no backup." Daniel's eyes burned with newfound clarity. "Then we make a plan." Eleanor hesitated. "Daniel." He met her gaze. "We find him." Because Arthur Whitmore wasn't just a billionaire. He was the only person who had believed in Daniel when no one else did, and Daniel wasn't about to let him die, no matter what it took. The air inside the abandoned cabin was thick with tension. Daniel stood in the middle of the wreckage, Arthur's crumpled note clenched tightly in his fist. "Michael knows." The words burned into his mind like a brand, a stark reminder that every second wasted brought them closer to losing Arthur forever. "We don't have time to sit here," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Michael has him. We need to figure out where he took him." Eleanor ran a hand through her hair, her face pale with exhaustion. "We have no leads, Daniel. Nothing. We're blind." Daniel's jaw tightened. Arthur knew he was running out of time. He left this note for a reason. He was trying to tell us something. Ethan, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, let out a dry chuckle. "And you think we'll just magically figure out where he went?" Daniel ignored him. Instead, he looked around the wrecked cabin, scanning the destruction with fresh eyes. If Arthur knew Michael was closing in, he would have left something more, something they had missed. His gaze landed on the desk, the wood splintered from an apparent struggle. Papers littered the surface, most of them useless financial records. But one thing stood out: an old map. Daniel grabbed it, unfolding it quickly. His breath hitched. A red circle was drawn over a single location: the Whitmore estate. Eleanor's eyes widened. "That's—" Daniel nodded. "Arthur's family home." Ethan frowned. Why the hell would he go back there? Daniel exhaled. Because that's where it all started. And now, that's where it would end. The Whitmore estate was a fortress, perched on the edge of a private cliffside, surrounded by acres of land and thick security. It had once been the jewel of Arthur's empire. Now, it was Michael's stronghold. Daniel, Eleanor, and Ethan crouched behind the tree line, surveying the mansion from a distance. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and efficient. "We're not getting in through the front," Eleanor whispered. Ethan smirked. "Good thing I don't do front doors." Daniel shot him a look. "You have a plan?" Ethan nodded toward the side of the estate. "Service tunnels. Old ones, built back when Arthur first expanded the property. They haven't been used in decades." Daniel's stomach tightened. This was risky. They had no idea what they were walking into, but they had no choice. "We go in quiet," Daniel said. "We find Arthur. We get out." No one argued, because deep down, they all knew. This was their only shot. The tunnels beneath the estate were dark and suffocating. Daniel moved cautiously, his breath shallow. The damp air clung to his skin, the scent of dust and mildew thick. Ethan led the way, his movements quick but careful. Eleanor followed behind, clutching the small flashlight they had found in the cabin. They emerged into a grand hallway, dimly lit by golden chandeliers. The estate was eerily silent. Too silent. Daniel's gut twisted. Something was wrong. And then, the lights flashed on, doors slammed open, figures stepped into the hall, guns drawn, and at the center of them all, Michael Whitmore. His expression was calm, almost amused. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up," Daniel's heart pounded. They had walked straight into his trap. Michael moved slowly toward them, his expensive suit crisp, his posture too relaxed for someone who had just been caught orchestrating a corporate takeover and an attempted murder. He stopped a few feet away, his sharp blue eyes locked onto Daniel. "You've been busy," he mused. Daniel clenched his fists. "Where is he?" Michael tilted his head. "You mean my dear father? Oh, he's nearby." Daniel's stomach twisted. That wasn't an answer. Michael smirked. "I'll admit, Daniel, you surprised me. I never expected a nobody like you to get this far." Daniel's blood boiled. "You tried to erase him, your own father." Michael's smile didn't fade. "He made his choice the day he tried to cut me out." Eleanor's voice was cold. "He cut you out because he saw what you are." Michael finally sighed, looking almost bored. "This is business, my dear, and you're all standing in the way of it." He nodded toward the guards. "Take them outside." Daniel's heart dropped. This was it. This was how it ended. And then, a gunshot. The room exploded into chaos. Ethan lunged first, tackling the nearest guard. Eleanor grabbed a heavy vase and smashed it into another. Daniel barely had time to react before he saw Arthur, tied to a chair in the adjacent room, weak but alive. Their eyes met, and Daniel ran. Gunfire rang out as he sprinted forward, ducking behind furniture. He reached Arthur, fumbling to untie the restraints. "Daniel," Arthur croaked, his voice hoarse. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel's fingers shook. "I wasn't going to leave you." Arthur gave a small, weak smile. "That's why you're different." Suddenly, Michael's voice cut through the air. "You're making a mistake, Daniel." Daniel froze. Michael stood just feet away, a gun aimed directly at Arthur's head. Michael's expression was cold, unforgiving. "You walk away right now," he said, "and I let you both live." Daniel's chest tightened. "Or," Michael continued, cocking the gun, "you stay, and I end this right now." Silence. The world stopped moving. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Michael thought he had won, but he didn't know Daniel at all. In one swift movement, Daniel lunged, grabbing the gun's barrel and jerking it away. The gun fired. A sharp pain ripped through Daniel's shoulder, but he didn't let go. With a burst of strength, he swung, slamming his fist into Michael's face. Michael stumbled back, blood trickling from his nose. Daniel didn't stop. He tackled him to the ground, his knuckles colliding against Michael's face again and again, years of anger, fear, and injustice pouring out in every punch. Until finally, Michael stopped moving. It was over. Ethan and Eleanor finished off the remaining guards. Daniel, bleeding but still standing, turned to Arthur. "Can you walk?" Arthur exhaled shakily. "Barely." Ethan stepped in, helping him up. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police, finally arriving. Michael Whitmore, bloody and unconscious, lay at their feet. Arthur turned to Daniel, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "You saved me." Daniel swallowed, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. "I owed you one." Arthur smiled. "Number you didn't." The once mighty Whitmore estate was now a crime scene. Flashing red and blue lights painted the massive mansion in streaks of color as police officers flooded the property. The air buzzed with frantic radio chatter, detectives scribbling notes, and forensic teams collecting evidence. Michael Whitmore, his face bloodied and bruised, sat slumped on the marble floor, his hands cuffed behind his back. The mask of confidence and arrogance was gone, replaced by cold, bitter silence. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching as two officers hauled him to his feet. Michael's gaze met his, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. "You have no idea what you've done," Michael muttered under his breath. Daniel's expression remained calm, unshaken. "I know exactly what I've done." Michael smirked, but there was no real power left in it. "You think this is over?" Daniel tilted his head. "I think it's just the beginning." The officers shoved Michael forward, escorting him out of the mansion toward the police cars waiting outside. And just like that, the man who had orchestrated betrayal, theft, and attempted murder was finally where he belonged, in handcuffs. Daniel turned away from Michael, his focus shifting to Arthur. The billionaire sat on a nearby couch, his breathing slow but steady. He was bruised, exhausted, but alive. Eleanor crouched beside him, wrapping a blanket over his shoulders. "You should be in a hospital," she said, concern clear in her voice. Arthur chuckled weakly. "Hospitals are for men weaker than me." Daniel smirked. "You were tied to a chair and nearly killed. I think you qualify." Arthur huffed but didn't argue. His tired eyes finally lifted to meet Daniel's, and for the first time in their short, chaotic history, there was no power dynamic between them. No billionaire and struggling young man, just two people who had fought to survive. Arthur extended his hand. Daniel hesitated, then clasped it. "Thank you," Arthur said, his voice hoarse but sincere. "I wouldn't be here without you." Daniel swallowed, feeling something unexpected stir in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he mattered. By morning, news of Michael Whitmore's arrest had spread. Headlines flashed across the city. "Billionaire betrayed. Michael Whitmore arrested in attempted takeover scandal." Arthur Whitmore found alive after months in hiding. Son accused of corruption. Corporate empire shaken by internal betrayal. What's next for Whitmore Enterprises? Daniel sat in Arthur's private study, scrolling through the articles. It felt surreal. Ethan entered the room, tossing a folder onto the desk. "It's done," he said. "The company's board has already moved to reinstate Arthur. Michael is out. Permanently." Arthur, seated beside Daniel, exhaled a slow, tired breath. "I always knew Michael had greed in him. I just never thought he'd turn it against his own family." Daniel frowned. "What happens now?" Arthur gave him a sidelong glance. "Now, I rebuild." Eleanor entered, leaning against the doorway. "And what about you, Daniel?" Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" Eleanor crossed her arms. "Arthur is getting his company back. Ethan is going back to his corporate world. But you?" Daniel hesitated. For the longest time he had been drifting, surviving. But now, he wasn't just a struggling man on the streets anymore. He had changed. Arthur studied him carefully before speaking. "You saved my life, Daniel," he said. "Not just once, but over and over again." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I just did what I thought was right." Arthur's lips twitched. "That's exactly why I need someone like you by my side." Daniel's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Arthur smiled. "I'm offering you a position, Daniel. A real one. You may not have a fancy degree, but you have something better. Loyalty, courage, and the ability to see things others don't." Daniel felt the weight of the offer settle in his chest. For the first time in years, he had a choice. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away from it. That evening, Daniel stood outside the Whitmore estate, staring at the city lights in the distance. Eleanor joined him, a cup of coffee in hand. "You're really going to do this?" Daniel exhaled. "I think I am." She smiled. "You deserve it, you know." Daniel chuckled. "We'll see about that." A comfortable silence settled between them. The wind was cold, but it didn't feel unbearable anymore. After a moment, Eleanor spoke again. "You changed, Daniel." Daniel turned to her, curious. "How so?" She met his gaze. "When I first met you, you were just a guy trying to survive." Daniel nodded. "And now?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Now? You're someone who fights for something bigger than himself." Daniel's chest tightened. Because she was right. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. Daniel Carter stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the skyline of a city that once felt impossible to reach. Just weeks ago, he had been living on the edge of survival, struggling for his next meal. Now, he was in Arthur Whitmore's corporate office, standing in a place he had never imagined himself belonging. Everything had changed. But somehow, he still felt like the same person. Arthur walked up beside him, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Daniel, the golden liquid catching the warm light of the evening sun. "Take a good look," Arthur said. "This is your new world now." Daniel hesitated before accepting the drink. "Still doesn't feel real." Arthur chuckled. "It will." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just reflective. Finally, Arthur spoke again. "You remind me of someone I once knew." Daniel turned to him. "Who?" Arthur's eyes softened. "My younger self." Daniel frowned. "You were never broke and sleeping on park benches." Arthur smirked. "No, but I knew what it was like to have nothing and fight for everything." Daniel absorbed his words, feeling a strange sense of connection. Maybe they weren't so different after all. The news about Michael Whitmore's downfall had spread like wildfire. The headlines continued to dominate every major outlet. Michael Whitmore sentenced. Corporate scandal shocks business world. Arthur Whitmore reclaims his empire. Justice is served. The unknown hero. Behind the fall of Michael Whitmore, who is Daniel Carter? Daniel didn't care much for the attention. He had never been someone who sought fame or recognition. He had simply done what felt right. Still, as he watched Michael's trial broadcast on TV, a part of him felt vindicated. Michael sat in the courtroom, his once perfect suit wrinkled, his posture slumped. The confidence, the arrogance, it was all gone. The judge's voice rang through the speakers. "Michael Whitmore, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, embezzlement, and attempted murder." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Michael's face remained blank. For the first time, he looked like a man who had truly lost everything. Daniel exhaled and turned off the TV. Justice had been served. But the past still wasn't fully behind them. A week later, Daniel found himself standing by a quiet riverbank, watching the water ripple under the late afternoon sun. Arthur had asked him to meet here, but Daniel knew this wasn't about business. Arthur arrived a few minutes later carrying a small wooden box. Without saying a word, he opened it. Inside was an old pocket watch. The metal was slightly rusted, the hands frozen at 3:45 p.m. Daniel furrowed his brows. "What is that?" Arthur exhaled. "This belonged to my father. It stopped ticking the moment he died." Daniel watched as Arthur ran his fingers over the surface, lost in thought. "For years I held on to this as a reminder," Arthur continued, "of my past, of my failures, of all the things I wished I had done differently." Daniel didn't speak. He just listened. Arthur closed the box. But now, it's time to let go. Without hesitation, he tossed the pocket watch into the river. Daniel watched as it sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the currents. For the first time since he had met Arthur, the older man looked at peace. As they walked away from the river, Arthur turned to Daniel. "You never answered my question," Arthur said. "Are you staying?" Daniel smirked. "You're really giving me a choice?" Arthur shrugged. "You don't belong to me. You could take the money I gave you, start over somewhere else. A fresh life, no more danger, no more corporate politics." Daniel considered it for a moment. For the first time in his life, he had options. But deep down, he already knew the answer. "I think I've found where I'm meant to be," Daniel finally said. Arthur smiled. "Then welcome to Whitmore Enterprises." The two men shook hands, not as billionaire and outsider, but as equals. Daniel had started this journey as a man with nothing. Now, he had everything that truly mattered.